my peers in the sector agree with, kind of fell into it, as opposed to being drawn into it or introduced into it. And in fact, I did my undergrad in comparative development studies at the University of Trent. And I actually left my undergrad being quite confident that I could not work in development. I was concerned with what I saw as that constant top-down, north to south approach, programs for program's sake that didn't really have anything to do with the people involved. And I left feeling like I was going to have to shift away from that as a potential career. And then I landed at a subsidiary of the Cooperators, an insurance company. And it took me about a year of working there to really learn that we actually were a cooperative and started to get interested in what that might mean. I had an opportunity to volunteer at the Cooperative Young Leaders Camp program that Erin would be very familiar with, and actually through there learned a ton about cooperation. And this started to tick all the boxes that I had been looking for when I was pursuing my development studies. Mutual self-help, chosen communities coming together to solve their own problems, people getting involved and, pooling their resources in order to help the many. So for me, all those boxes started ticking, and I thought back through my education and I thought back through the development world and really felt like cooperatives could be more a part of the solution. Actually, though, when I traveled back to Ecuador, which is where I spent some time during my undergrad, I actually realized that co-ops were all around me. And so much like what Caroline was talking about last night, not only informally but formally, there was cooperation happening all around me. And I had been blinded, I think, a little bit by my formal education to not see that these activities were already going on around me. So I think I'll leave it at that. But I've been with the cooperators now for almost 24 years, and have continued to evolve my work into the focus on cooperatives and cooperation. And feel very fortunate to be a part of this broad community.
Thank you, Wendy. I think that sentiment of trying to kind of connect to the real world of what's happening and what we describe as development is something that many of our students and indeed faculty share here at the university as well. Erin, I'll turn next to you then.
Okay. Do you want me to talk to you?
You
don't know where to go.
Yeah, take your choice.
Okay. So I got into cooperation in the cooperative sector also kind of accidentally in a way. I graduated the University of Guelph with my degree in agriculture, and one of my first jobs was with the Ontario Bio Organic Farmers Cooperative, which makes organic meadow milk, or made organic meadow milk. But so my job was member relations, and I had to drive around to each one of the member farms and ask all the questions about their choices of why they chose organic and how does it work, and also tell me about the cooperative, tell me about why you're part of it. And so I just by learning from them, learning from the individual farmers, I figured out the power of cooperation and why they were all there. And at the time, it was like back when organic milk was brand new, and this whole idea of organics was brand new, and they were really pioneering. And so for them, it was, and for the province, it was really innovative. And this, so to me, cooperation, in my mind, was sort of synonymous with innovation, but innovation for everyone, so that everyone could benefit. And it was a real grassroots effort. And so that's my first job, where I learned the power of the grassroots, the power of organizing and leveraging everyone's talents for the greater good. And then I went on to work in primary agriculture for 20 years, and then came back to now I'm back in the cooperative sector with the Ontario Cooperative Association. And so we are 1,500 plus cooperatives in Ontario. And that's just formal cooperatives, not counting the informal. And we're on a real mission for transformation in Ontario, especially post-pandemic. We're looking at how can we take what we know, this idea of collaboration, and embrace the much broader economy and more inclusively collaborate and bring in the informal groups.
Okay, and would you describe your association as one that also tries to influence and lobby government? Is that?
Definitely, we definitely are trying to influence and lobby government. We've had multiple goals over the years. I mean, most recently, we have a 45-year-old Cooperative Corporations Act, and it's not updated. The government has a really hard time with cooperatives just in general at figuring out like what we do and how our corporations should be structured and regulated. And so a lot of our lobby effort is just basic education within the province.
I think we may well come back to the theme of agriculture later on in the discussion, but thank you, Erin. Next on my list then is Nora.
Okay. No, thank you, Craig. I think for me, when I think about cooperatives, it goes back to my childhood. I was born in Cameroon and with grandparents who were all farmers. And very early, I remembered, how they farm by themselves. But when the cooperatives started to come around agriculture and they became a part of it, I began to see how much more they were thriving rather than just surviving. So my memory of cooperatives is certainly built from the bottom, is grassroots, but really as that element that I saw within my own context and my own space, helped to make people feel empowered, feel resilient, actually were able to feel respected and dignified by what they did and everything. So, and I saw it not just only in agriculture, it then became, as Caroline said yesterday, more of the Rockers spirit, because it was people came together to work each other's farms, people came together for childbirth, they came together to support each other for funerals, they came together to help each other build homes. Yeah. So there was a wide range of things that people cooperating were able to do for themselves and so on. And I think for me, it's really seeing how it has evolved, as I went to school, got educated, understood more about, the cooperative movement. It was very interesting. I think there was one time where in Africa, as the political maturity was happening and there was a cooperative movement, there was a tension between cooperatives being considered as, basis for political movement. Mm-hmm. And so at one time, I don't have the full history, it sort of, quieting down a little bit. But I think certainly now, with the way people want to help themselves, taking things where people have the authority and the agency to decide what they want, I really strongly believe in the cooperative movement. And I joined MEDA about 2 years, soon to be 3 years, and MEDA, Mennonite Economic Development Association. I was really excited, for several reasons. But one of it is that it was actually formed in 1953 as a mutual aid. So through that whole perspective, to say that it's been going on, it is an organization that actually believes in that mutual aid, in that mechanism, in terms of how we work. And the other piece about what we do at MEDA is that once we want to work with smallholder farmers, if we come up to the cooperative level, we're almost at the aggregator lead firm level, and it is much more resilient. So I'll stop there for now, but really saying that for me it is both personal and professional.
Thank you so much, Dory. I mean, there's so many themes in there that I think we can pick up on too. It reminds me of some of the really positive cases I used to see in India where dairy cooperatives, in spite of, I think, a checkered history of cooperatives in general, dairy cooperatives worked very well, and they provided not just the material benefits of being able to sell and get a bit of an income every day, but also the things that you're describing too, like collective action and solidarity. Yeah. Okay. We'll turn next then to Serge on the screen. So over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for inviting me to the event. And just following up on Dorothy's introduction, I similarly had more of a childhood memory when I think of cooperatives. I'm an Acadian from Nova Scotia. And yesterday during the presentation, we mentioned a little bit about the cooperative movement in Atlantic Canada, and it was very strong in my community, a fishing village in which credit unions was the lifeblood of the banking system in our village. And I do remember fondly my grandfather talking about going with my grandmother to the members meeting, annually and discussing the importance of helping local businesses in that regard. More recently, I've become a member of the Crynyard Credit Union, which is a credit union here in the community, and been engaged in the AGM and the like, and it's been a great experience. Unfortunately, in my day-to-day business, I'm a co-managing partner in a private investment firm called Soran Asset Management that does impact investments in emerging markets. And because we mostly do investments, we do equity investments as well as debt investments. And the cooperative movement is a bit challenging for at least equity investments. But some of our partners have lent to cooperatives. As you know, there are many cooperatives and credit unions in the developing world, and those are very important partners to have in these markets. So that's been a bit of my connection with the cooperative. I certainly see the value of the work that they do in providing a fair and equitable way of distributing resources to benefit communities.
Great, thank you, Serge. And last but not least, Caroline.
Yeah, I think some people heard a bit of my story, but it was great listening to everyone share their connections to cooperatives. And I think that this Hopper lecture on co-ops in Guelph is really significant, and it's really an honor to be here today. So thank you for making this happen, the folks at IDRC and the University of Guelph. I come here as an academic, so I'm on this panel speaking as someone who writes and scribes and thinks about cooperativism, but cooperativism in a broader sense beyond just what is formal, recognizing that there are lots of formal co-ops around the world, but also to think through what does informality look like in the cooperative world? How do we open up the space? So like Dorothy in some ways, I have lots of lived experience, but in an urban context, in a developed country context with racially marginalized people who use these kinds of informal ROSCA systems that they see as co-ops. They have a lot of the same shared values that co-ops follow. And I, have seen those activities be so important to new immigrants when they can't access formal credit, even in a place as developed as Canada. They have a hard time getting their credit history together, and also just finding friendships. They'll pool together, meet up at a church or something like that to participate in these cooperative institutions. But I should say that, actually working with co-ops, I did that when I was a volunteer actually in Benin, West Africa. And I worked with these things called tontines, and they're women co-ops, and that's just how they pooled monies to do a variety of what they called at the time were income generating activities, right? IGAs, and it was always done first as a cooperative sort of business. People thought as an after fact they would organize individualized, but it was always thought of the tontine as a pooled resource. And people would bike to each other's houses, they would send their kids to make the deposits. And that's when I got hooked in realizing that, wow, we have something before us. We're always trying to think about, do we do development or not? Are there alternatives? But we actually have all these really viable institutions that exist in places like Canada, but also elsewhere. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. I'm going to open things up in a minute. I'm going to use the next question to do that. But before doing so, I'll throw my cards on the table. I'm a political scientist by training. To be honest, I haven't worked an enormous amount in recent years on cooperatives, but I was telling Caroline yesterday that my first encounter with cooperatives was also in kind of living with and working with fishing communities in southern Thailand. And there they had, I certainly didn't call them this, and they weren't called this in Thai, but they were ROSCAs. They were rotating credit associations where fisher folk would have a rotating fund that they would bid on actually to get access to the fund, and then and then allocated amongst themselves. The other interesting thing that I remember when, Dorothy, when you were introducing yourself, was that some of these associations came out of burial societies.
Yeah.
Very, very common in Southeast Asia, and I think in Latin America too. But interesting, and I think this links to the next question I have about challenges and opportunities. In this case, the Thai government reacted very violently against burial societies and informal associations at the village level during the Cold War, during the fight against communism. And for me, it, I think, raises interesting questions then about how this sector is changing. Like we've got a great sense of where people have come from, how you come into the sector, how you see it, but I'm interested in hearing people's thoughts about what the new challenges and opportunities are in relation to the co-op sector. And Aaron, I'll start with you because before the panel started today, you referred to the cooperative sector being the next revolution. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. Well, I think that I was watching this really interesting documentary that was talking about how productivity peaked 20 years ago, and we're never going to achieve the same level of productivity that we achieved, and that unless we revolutionize and the way we do business. And to sort of sum up, I think I got it right. It's the Internet of Things, combined with just the availability of data, the sharing economy, all these things, the world moving online, along with renewable energy, is going to improve productivity again. But there's sort of a dark side. There's the dark web, and there's also sort of capitalism that comes into play. That we will be most successful at moving the economy along and making the economy accessible to everyone, and everyone, that sort of equity and equality that everyone's looking for. We will only achieve that if the internet and data is common, is available, is like if everyone can access it around the world. And if the data becomes siloed, or if the dark web takes over, then we won't achieve this ability for equality and equity in the world. And so we're at a really pivotal moment in history with technology. And the only way forward to make sure that we have a world that we can really live in where we sort of eliminate this distance between the 1% and 99 is if technology is available to everyone, if it's accessible to everyone, and we have to really work to make sure it's accessible. And so I think, like when you talk about the differences between 20 years ago and today, the biggest difference is technology and what that has enabled, but also if you look at the gig economy, there's a real downside, right? So people who are driving for Uber were first in, we're making all kinds of money, but slowly that income has degraded over time. And the real solution for everyone to be able to participate in the economy is cooperativism in some fashion, whether it's formal or informal. We have to come together and make technology available to all and give everyone a platform and an ability to participate in the economy. And it's going to happen with the internet. And it's also going to happen with organizations having that mission and speaking loudly.
Right. I mean, does crowdsourcing, does this kind of highly decentralized and very technology dependent kind of financial cooperation, would that be part of what you're thinking?
It would be part of it. Like I think about my 16-year-old son, and I think about when he gets all excited, he's playing video games. He gets very excited, and he talks about how, there's all these game companies that are making these games, but those games are boring. The cool games are when everybody gets together and creates their own. And there's like these platforms that kids can get together and they create their own games, and all the technology is so available to do it. And so that's kind of the future of like everyone being able to, pick their path, pick their interest, and then generate income from it the same way that women, you know, in West Africa can get together and talk about, you know, the way that they want to participate in the economy collectively, and it can happen online too. So,
it's fascinating to hear about this and just to think about the ways in which technology is changing the foundations.
we just have to be really careful about data.
Yeah.
Like, there are a lot of people talking about data cooperatives. I know the IDRC is talking about data cooperatives and how that has to be the next, like, the people have to own their data.
Yeah.
In order to protect everything so that we can participate in the economy.
Right.
And not have other companies dictate how we participate in the economy.
Yeah.
Because they own our data.
Right, right. Wendy, I think I'll turn the floor to you. You're with a large cooperative that is, I think, partly in the, or a lot in the formal sector, or what we might call the formal sector, but also kind of a membership-based cooperative.
Mm-hmm.
Be interested to hear what things look like from your perspective.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that it's interesting to hear Erin talk about revolution, and I certainly hope co-ops are part of it, but I really do believe there needs to be an internal revolution sort of within the co-op sector itself as well. Caroline said last night about sort of the pale, stale, and male. No offense, but it is definitely a truth. You know, I look around the room at meetings of our membership within the cooperators, and you know, it's an aging, very white, very homogenous population. And yet, you know, obviously the people involved are not immune to the need to be more inclusive, the need to be more conscientious of diversity and representation. But honestly, it seems to me that no one has the slightest idea how to go about it. And one of the things I loved about your lecture last night, Caroline, is you framed it as an opportunity, right? So it's not the idea to bring in and embrace more of the informal organizations that are already doing amazing work and cooperating in new and different ways. It's not a threat. It's an opportunity because you can expand, you can find new voices, you can, you know, diversify what's going on. You know, there's a real threat, I think, of losing ongoing relevance, of losing the ability to continue to grow and thrive and expand. And I think that there's Caroline's really offered an incredible option and opportunity for a solution to that. So I think that's very much needed. I think these conversations are difficult and often uncomfortable for people. When you think about how co-ops are formed in the first place, it's, you know, people coming together to meet their unmet needs, and often these are very homogenous communities, you know, coming together to meet their needs. So how do you also integrate openness? How do you start looking at other things that might not be able to tick off all 7 of the principles in exactly the right formal way? And how do you bring those organizations or informal organizations into the fold to learn from one another? So I think there's a real opportunity. And actually, interestingly enough, the International Cooperative Alliance is actually re-looking at their cooperative principles. They're having an annual or a giant global congress in Singapore. In Korea, I think, in December, and they're going to launch, you know, a new look at the cooperative principles. And I really hope that this is what the conversation looks and feels like, is how do we bring some of the local and informal knowledge of cooperation that's happening across the globe into the cooperative movement.
There's a diversity, equity, and inclusion principle, and a principle is adopted by credit.
Yeah, maybe you could say that. I don't know if has it been adopted yet?
It hasn't been adopted by the ICA, but credit unions in the States came up with a diversity, equity, and inclusion 8th principle that they've all signed on to. Whether the ICA adopts it or not, it's their 8th principle. They're encouraging everyone to adopt it.
I mean, I'm fascinated by how these kind of transnational norms get adopted and diffused across countries and jurisdictions, but
Slowly.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. We'll come back to that though in a minute. I want to shift over to Dorothy now, and I mean, I'm glad, Wendy, that you raised sort of the crucial need to move beyond the tempted to say I resemble that comment, the pale, male, what is it, stale constituency. But MEDA is an organization that both is a cooperative, but also does a lot of what I would call development work in the global south. And would be interested just in hearing your reflections then on challenges and opportunities that you see.
Yeah, no, I just want to touch on what Wendy said about, the cooperative movement needed to be sort of internally deconstructed. And I think as part of that deconstruction, it's really the power analysis. So whilst we all sit here, we have a social location, even me or Caroline or, Erin, all of us hear you, that we're talking about this, and cooperative movements exist in the global south. So how do we deconstruct it in such a way that we're not only building diversity and inclusion here, but making sure that the cooperative movements also in the global south also have an equal and viable voice at the table.
Yeah.
And I say this because I think there's some cooperatives that are really mega cooperatives, like they've franchised themselves out, and they're everywhere. And how much of that is you just carrying something from one country to the other to replicate, versus how do you listen to the people in terms of what they need and what they want to do, and actually structure their own cooperative needs around that. So I think for me, as I said, we were started as a mutual aid, and we work, internationally. And the biggest challenge I think for us is our ability as a Northern-based international organization to be able to create the space that our partners in the global south need to actually come to the table with equal voice. So I think we're in a sector that has come through with a lot of saviorism. We're going to save these people. But I want to say, my grandmother already knew how to get into a self-help group. So nobody needs to come and teach her, how to do it. So I think there is how we listen, how we actually hear, and how we respect those opinions, but actually make sure that they are reflected in the more global conventions and documents that get produced, and not just maybe what the Americans want or what the Canadians have brought to the table. So I think for me that the challenge, moving forward is really in terms of voice, power analysis. I think that the opportunity that I see is that, the cooperative movement, I think they can only do things up to a certain level. And I'll say that by just reflecting back on my own family, seeing what happened. Because if we want to have people really thrive, the cooperative movement equalizes, then to take things to the next stage, we need to either get them into the formal sector, and I say this with a lot of trepidation, because Caroline said yesterday about there's a risk of trying to over-formalize the rosters. I say this because at the end of the day, it's a global world. If I have a smallholder farmer doing coffee in Colombia, I need to get them into a global value chain, right? Whether they're doing it through a cooperative, and then the cooperative is doing it through another aggregator. So I really think that, there is a need to revamp the cooperative movement, then actually situate them within that ecosystem so that it is moving quickly into a little bit more formalized structure, so that they can continue to thrive in a way that can be sustainable, resilient. And I think that's where, when Seth spoke, he talked about, as an investor, they're not doing a lot of the cooperative movement work. But I think that what we should be looking at is, what's that next stage, for people? There will always be people coming in as members of the credit union, but then there are people who need to be shareholders of, TD Bank, I'm just using that as an example. And that's the reality, of society.
Yeah, I mean, that's a theme that came up during the talk last night, was sort of the relationship between informal and formal, but also the point you're raising too is, I mean, it seems to me that ROSCAs work well, or they can work when you've got face-to-face relationships, you've got underlying social relations that create trust and the reciprocity that might be needed for it to work. But as Eleanor Ostrom would tell us, as these groups grow, then there's no guarantee, or it becomes more difficult to ensure that people are indeed cooperating. And I mean, I didn't ask it last night, but I was tempted to ask about, well, what about the evidence of ROSCAs that don't work, and where you have people not getting paid or people absconding with the money. But
And in addition to add that, I think with the ROSCAs and cooperatives already are formal, they are a registered entity, no matter what. But some of these ROSCAs entities that are not quite registered, again, it's how do we ensure that they can fit into the formal system somewhere down the line? Because I can be in a ROSCA, but our system has been set up that there's a way in which we figure out a credit score, right? And so where does that ROSCA fit in? But it was very interesting. I want to give the example of Kenya, where there's a young lady who actually helped the mainstream banks to figure out a scorecard on how to score credit for women, like in the ROSCAs and places like that. So I think that's something that we could certainly say, how do we bring that to a place like Canada? Because the women and those who participate in it, they're committed and can be trusted.
Yeah, I think credit scoring too. I mean, it's a frightening phenomenon that Aaron raised a few minutes ago about privacy and information. And I think there are many companies where if you go to look for a deal on a mortgage, that will count against your credit score.
Yeah.
Turning to the investment sector then, and as from the perspective of an organization that manages assets and invests in emerging markets, Serge, I'd be interested in hearing then your reactions and reflections then on the sector and then how it relates to what you do.
Sure. And I saw Arjan asked a question, so I might start from there, but I'd love to hear if others have questions as well. Maybe a little bit more about Sirona as a firm. We manage about $420 million in emerging markets, and we do a lot of our work in private equity. And so to work on Arjan's question, like why is it difficult to invest in cooperatives, at least on the private equity side, the main reason is because it's not conducive to an equity investment. One member, one vote. We typically, come in at, depending on the capital allocation we would have, if we might be investors at 5%, 10%, 25%, but then we would expect 5, 10, or 25% of the economic returns and voting rights as a result of that investment in equity. So the cooperative movement is a bit challenging in that regard from an equity perspective. But from a debt perspective, one can think of creative ways around this problem. And I'm just thinking out loud, we're in the process of setting up a fintech fund that will focus on providing debt funding to fintech players in emerging markets. And the way we've gotten around this, there might be some lessons, like some ways around this for cooperatives as well, as we've set up what's called special purpose vehicles, which are bankruptcy remote structures in which we technically own the loans that have been issued out. But what it does is it allows the fintech not to have it on their balance sheet. And where this might be interesting, and I haven't thought a lot about this, but where I was thinking where it would be interesting from a cooperative perspective is you could have local groups who are finding it difficult to scale up because they're a cooperative, because they can't raise equity, for example, might be able to set up these special purpose vehicle bankruptcy remote structures in which they earn a share of the returns from those loans, but then they're not as concerned about the equity to be able to scale up their operations. So anyway, just food for thought, something that just dawned on me that this would be an interesting way for us to support cooperatives without necessarily investing in them, to answer Arjan's very specific question.
Thank you for sharing that question. We're not able to see the chat from here, so.
Oh, sorry. I should have. Sorry about that. I assumed you could, so I should probably. I was just going through this and thinking everybody saw the question. The question was, when there is time for questions, would love to hear from Serge on reasons why co-ops are difficult for impact investors. That was the question. So I was just sort of addressing that in my response.
Well, it's a good question, and in the spirit of kind of opening democratic forums for hearing people's voices. I'm glad that you shared it with us.
Yeah.
Caroline, do you have some?
Just a few, but I think most of it's been said about the challenges and opportunities. But I think that when you think of where the formal co-op sector has moved, I mean, I think that, you know, traditionally or historically, you can go to places in the South, same as here in Canada, and you'll find a lot of very male, masculine dominated institutions. But I do think that there's been a shift, and we're witnessing that today. You know, I think we have some powerful speakers here today, Wendy, Erin, and Dorothy, who represent, you know, varied ways of looking at the cooperative sector. And so that speaks to this kind of really critical feminist lens or perspective that is actually sort of troubling the sector, as Wendy says, to start doing things from within, right? And so I think that that's a big emergence that we shouldn't not look at and start to appreciate that there are a lot more women cooperators in the formal sector who are now starting to ask the very homogeneous men that Wendy sit with, how do we now start rethinking what cooperativism looks like? And maybe to start with the definition of who counts as a cooperative. Right now, there's lots of debate and discussion going on about what is a cooperative identity. And it's been heated at times. I was at an event at the National Cooperative Business Association, CLUSA, a few weeks ago, and that was sort of a major topic of debate and tension. There was actually a session on the invisibility of women in the cooperative sector. So we are starting to see some really strong women cooperators come to the fore and ask some important questions. So like the 8th principle that Erin mentioned on equity, diversity, inclusion, there's still a lot of debate and controversy about whether that's necessary, right? And maybe that's an opportunity for us here to think about, because we're here, why not us come together maybe beyond this session, and we can think about let's write something and think about what that could look like for Canada, right? And what do we have to say to the ICA? Dorothy speaks to sort of this idea of Canadian-led development, but you know, people don't need saving. She's heading up one of these foremost institutions in Canada, which is no easy task to be a Black woman running an institution that was primarily white for decades. I probably don't know, but you could have been the only Black person to be in that leadership role. I could be wrong, but what I'm getting at is that she's a Canadian that could actually now start thinking about how do we redefine what cooperativism looks like in development? Why are we continually exporting expertise when we can also bring it inside of our country to help us deal with issues of equity and inclusion? And so I think that sort of giving credit to some of these women, particularly feminists, women who are in the practice of development, may not define themselves as that, but I think that that's what they're doing, is something that has really shifted the formal co-op sector in good ways.
I love that idea of trying to actually use a roundtable in a workshop to
write something on that 8th principle for Canada, because we should get in front of that. I hope someone's going to the Korea conference. Anyone?
Alexandra Wilson is going representing Canada.
Oh, who is she? What?
She's the vice president of the CMC, the Cooperatives and Mutuals Canada Board.
Oh, good.
And John Kay is going, and I believe John Kay is going. He's the chair of the CMC board, and then the acting CEO of CMC.
Oh, great.
He is also
Is anyone going from the cooperators, Wendy?
Well, actually, Alexandra Wilson is also on the cooperators board. And we support her involvement representing Canada on the ICA. You know, at this point, I'm not even able to attend a meeting down the road at the University of Guelph. So we're not going to be sending any staff because we're still not comfortable with putting our staff out at public meetings. So I'm certainly not getting on an airplane to Korea, unfortunately.
Okay.
But we should organize a national roundtable.
Yep.
On our position.
And actually, they are looking to run some consultations. Sonia Nokovic from the University of St. Mary's is actually chairing the co-op principles, the co-op identity principles committee for the ICA, I believe. So we definitely have an in to potentially put together a consultation or a roundtable that would contribute to that work.
Oh, great. Then we should share that with folks here. I'd be interested. Dorothy?
Yep.
Yeah.
We'd be happy to host anything,
Okay.
facilitate, whatever it might take.
That's great. Thanks for sharing that.
We're about 50 minutes in to the roundtable, and got another 40 minutes to go, give or take. I do want to open things up to participants, and both online and in the room in a few minutes, but I'm sort of shifting gears a little bit from the written program, but I think we've covered some questions that I was going to ask already, but also I think new ones are emerging. And just picking up on Caroline's last comment, and also picking up on some of the things you said last night in your talk. I mean, I'm wondering about sort of models and levers for change. Dorothy, you've mentioned sort of the utility of doing a power analysis, a means of understanding how effective proposals for change or realistic they might be. And Caroline, you talked last night about the so-called Kerala model of development, but also of the cooperative sector. I'd be interested in hearing people's thoughts about what works. Like what kind of model are we working towards? What has been shown to work? And Erin, you mentioned earlier that your organization is involved in lobbying the government and working with this ancient Cooperatives Act to try to modernize it. I'd love to hear just people's thoughts about kind of what is working and where do you need to go in order to make it work. So Erin, I'll start with you.
Sure, I think that what needs to work, I don't know, like I know it's working places, but we can do better. I really am my next deep dive is going to be around collaboration work. The IDRC is doing a bunch of work on co-design, a bunch of research. That's a really a topic of interest to a number of people from the IDRC is this idea of co-design. You know, collaborative design is happening in the software industry. How can we take what's learned there? How can we take what's working in India, what's working in African countries? Let's take a look around the world at the best practices of collaboration and cooperation and learn from them. But like, let's go in with a real purpose of saying, okay, for us at OCA, we want to be really good at cooperative intercollaboration. So this idea of peace, one of our principles is cooperation amongst cooperatives. But no individual cooperative working in their sort of individual silo is going to get really good at collaborating with credit unions, daycare cooperatives, Froskas. That's not their mandate. Yeah. But our mandate at OCA is to figure out how to bring large groups of people together to talk about big things. And how do you do that with the latest technology? How do you do that effectively? So that's a big question that I'm asking, and people are doing it extremely well. And it's not all within the cooperative sector. I mean, like people just in the world are starting to do that really well with available technology. And the pandemic has like accelerated that as well. Like it sort of forced people to think more collaboratively outside of we're all going to sit in a room together and not leave until we've sorted this out. We can't do that. And so how do we expand our level? How do we think online?
Yeah, no, I love that idea. Even today, just the idea of having a hybrid event is now something that we're comfortable with, and technology works, and it does produce new ways of thinking.
So I don't know if that's helpful, but that's where my brain is right now.
Yeah, no, it is absolutely. Wendy, you mentioned earlier, I think some of the challenges you've been dealing with in your sector and your organization. What are some of the changes? What's working, and where do you need to go?
Well, I think I think what's working is cooperatives realizing that they need to be part of the current social changes and shifts. So I mean, I'm hopeful. I know I was maybe a bit negative in what I what I was sharing before but I actually see people around these rooms asking the questions, right? We want to be more representative of the Canadian society. We need our boards to reflect this. We need to figure out how to engage more people in governance. They don't know how, I would say, still, or are a bit struggling with that. But I think the desire is starting to be there, as well as a recognition that continued relevance is essential for your cooperative to continue. So, as some cooperatives have demutualized in Canada, kind of high-profile ones like Mountain Equipment Co-op last year, demutualizing, being sold to a venture capitalist organization from the United States. There was a lot of frustration and anger, and some of that was directed at the guardians, the board of directors of the cooperative, for not sticking true to the cooperative values. So there's sort of both tensions going on. There's this desire to bring people in from outside and to enhance the diversity, but also a desire to figure out how do we stay true to our principles, or how do we ensure that the principles are continuing to be relevant as we go forward. And this can be a natural tension sometimes for when, I mean, we've been talking about co-ops in the development space, maybe a little bit more than co-ops in sort of the commercial space, or in, the for-profit business enterprise, like my cooperative is a for-profit cooperative organization. So there's always these tensions between trying to ensure that you're running an effective, growing business, as well as staying true to your cooperative principles and values. So I think what's going well is that these questions are being asked, these things are being discussed. Board tables are having conversations about diversity and about relevance and about how do we avoid the scenario like what we saw happen at Mountain Equipment Co-op. What does that look like? How do we shift our cooperation and our collaboration to work around what Erin was talking about with like the gig economy, and how do you bring people in, and how do you connect people that live and work in different places? How, all of these kinds of things. I think what's really going for us is that we're asking the questions, and so I'm really hopeful that these questions will lead to real change going forward. So I mean, I certainly remain hopeful that there will be change, and that the sector will figure out a way to maintain its relevance and its value, and then also to be able to participate in all of these other great revolutions and changes happening all over the world.
That's Wendy. I'm really glad you distinguished among sort of the more charitable mutual aid societies we've been talking about, and the for-profit cooperatives. And it strikes me too that there are many public and private sector institutions that are trying to do something about many of the issues we've been discussing. So improving equity, diversity, and inclusion, divesting from fossil fuel investments, having good principles on ESG. But is there something different, I guess, than about a cooperative? Because I know in a university it's very different. I don't think it's anywhere near a member-based organization that I have in mind when I'm thinking of the cooperators or other cooperatives. I'll just leave it there, but I'll move over to Dorothy then, and just sort of get you to reflect a little bit on kind of what you see as working, what are some of the best practices and the ways forward from your perspective.
Yeah, I think that, at this time, certainly COVID has redefined a lot of, what we thought was working and not working, but I think what I think, has been working has been the ability of the cooperative movement to give voice, to people, for people to feel they're members of something, giving them agency, and that sense of holistic well-being, I think any society cannot undervalue, because, it takes a lot, to get people in a sentimental state, which is really empowering for them. So I think that in itself has worked, not only in Canada, even in the global south, when people are part of the cooperative, they own something, it's a sense of belonging, it's a sense of pride, that is really good. I feel like, where do we go from here? I think in the global north, there is a structural system and an enabling environment that allows for this very, how can I call it, positive coexistence of for-profit cooperatives, the not-for-profit ones, the social ones, and that enabling environment through government regulation and policy allows things to happen, and people have the option to, today I want to be in, Mountain Pop, tomorrow I want to go join Kindred, because you still, even though Kindred is a credit union, it's a members credit union, there's profits, that you get, and then later on you can go elsewhere. And I think that what we go from here is really, how do we ensure that across the world, even in the global south, the cooperative, people begin to look at it that way. Say in Ghana, the Susus, how do they become part of that ecosystem in a very concrete way, such that people feel like it is maybe my time to be in the Susu, and later on I'm going to be part of a credit union, and later on I could be part of something else. That is a pathway of sorts that allows people to leave the system, when they feel like they don't need to be part of it, but also have other places where they can go to continue to have access to whatever the cooperative movement.
That makes me think too of some of the points you were raising last night, Caroline, about these very informal ROSCAs being formed in the GTA and then facing things like police investigations and audits and all sorts of suspicions about what's going on. I'll come back to you in a second. I just want to go to Serge then. I mean, Serge, you were there last night at dinner after the talk, but Mountain Equipment Co-op that Wendy just mentioned, it came up a few times, and I think it's the only co-op that I actually am a member of, and I might change that after the last 2 days.
Well, you're not one anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
There is no shipping.
It used to be. And I think there was lots of sort of consternation about sort of what happened both internally, that the co-op abandoned its principles, but also is turned into a completely different organization now as a result of this investment. So I guess, not putting you on the spot, but maybe I am, like from the investment sector's perspective, I mean, how do you look at that case or cases like it?
Yeah, so I did make it to the supper because I was listening in virtually, but I do know about the Mountain Equipment Co-op case, and I was a member with my wife. Yeah, thinking through, I mean, clearly the private equity firm that bought into the company didn't do a lot of homework about who the customers are, why they're participating in Mountain Equipment Co-op versus maybe some other options they might have, like Mountain Warehouse and the other competitors in the market. And if I had been involved in the transaction, which I was not, by the way, if I had been involved, I would have thought through, maybe think like there's always creative solutions around this. So, for example, the brand of MEC is about the members going to this location and working with the employees who are wedded to making sure that you get a good experience out of this. But what they're essentially selling are goods, right? They're selling MEC branded goods. So you could have easily, and sorry, this is just me putting my private equity hat on here, you could have easily separated the company that retails the products from the company that makes the products. Easily. Super simple. And then you could have said, hey, we're MEC, the firm, the retail firm, is going through financial difficulties. We need a creative solution to solve our problems. And then you could have kept the membership base as the retail stores, and then have the private equity say, we like your MEC products. Those are good quality products, which we can sell in the MEC stores, but we could also sell in other stores. To be able to leverage the high quality products that you've produced over the last 50, 60 years. And yes, it would have made it maybe not as great for the members in a way, because then the MEC products, you would have seen maybe MEC products elsewhere in other store shelves. But ultimately, there was a way to salvage the cooperative and the business model without giving away the spirit of why it was created. But unfortunately, I wasn't involved in the decision. I'm just giving you some creative solutions, like the one I just gave you about how to finance cooperatives without necessarily being an equity investor. There's many creative solutions out there. All you need to have is the courage to come up with those ideas.
Yeah. I mean, I won't speak for myself, but I know that MEC members are a very bright and progressive bunch, and I would wonder sometimes whether the membership would stand for that kind of change in organizational behavior. That in some ways it's more than just the good; it's also the.
But what I would say is the point is the members weren't asked, and I think this was a lot of the frustration of the membership across the country, especially those who really spoke up. I mean, a Save MEC campaign was launched. Every member that I spoke to said, you know, if I had to put $25, you know, towards helping bail out this problem, I would have done it. That there was never really any genuine member consultation, which is really what we're supposed to be about, right? I mean, I'm not a mountain climber. I don't really care that much about accessing, you know, high quality mountain climbing equipment, but I did care about being a member of something that was, you know, intended to provide access to the right products and materials for people to be able to get outside and explore all the great things that Canada has to offer, and, you know, and so on. And I think that a lot of the members of MEC across the country would have happily come to the table, at least for discussions about what it could look like. But the reason why they're held up a lot of times as a case study for where things can go wrong is that, you know, they were really far removed from their membership by the time the financial crisis was hitting them. This was not, you know, they had a very professional board. Board members were, you know, selected by the current board and promoted as the ones that should be elected versus, you know, genuine democracy that co-ops strive for. And I mean, there's been a lot of case studies written by smarter folks than me, but I think it's a really important example for the Canadian co-op sector to talk about a lot, because it's a good reminder, you know, for us about how easily you can drift away and start to look a lot more like your competition than like what you were originally created for, or what the members, you know, started you for or participate in you in the first place.
That's a great point that brings us, I think, to one of the bigger themes that we've been talking around a little bit today, which is sort of creating an environment for open and transparent and democratic kind of participation in discourse, and also what it means to be a cooperative. I'm going to open the floor up in a minute, but Caroline, I'd love to just give the floor to you.
Small things, because I wish that Sifa Cheonge was here. We had actually invited someone from the Global South who's based in Nairobi, Kenya, but she was ill. I'm not sure if everyone got hold of that information, because she would have probably inserted what Dorothy was mentioning, is that, you know, having Global South perspective in this conversation is really important. And I'm not trying to replace Sifa by any means, because she's a force in her own right. But I think that what she would have said is, you know, there are lots of cooperatives who are taking life risks against commercialization in their countries. And, you know, the quilombolas of Brazil, we have the MST worker co-ops, not just in Brazil, but also in places like Haiti and Argentina, have really done really daring, bold sort of reactions against capitalist types of firms, just to reform and transform the way that the economic system is operating in their country, when it's actually killing people, displacing people from their land. You have Sewa, started out as a trade union, but really embraced cooperative ideas and principles. I think that if Sewa was here, she would tell you that at so many cooperative meetings, global meetings, you're really hard pressed to find people, but you'll always find Sewa or even Marata. These are self-help cooperative institutions that are a mix mash of both formal and formal, and somehow they negotiate that for the women of India. Michelle Stack, I just want to throw this in here because I think you mentioned, Craig, we think of universities as very distinct, but there's a professor at UBC called Michelle Stack who's been thinking about, or I guess kind of writing and dreaming about, what does it take to make the university a cooperative? Like, is that something that's so far-fetched, or can we actually do this? Many of us have restaurants and bookstores that are taking on a cooperative model, but she's pushing this idea that can universities move away from a corporate model and become something that is more cooperative or collectively owned, even though they're state funded, but can we embrace a different model? And that kind of speaks to what Erin said earlier when we just started off. She said, you know, sometimes the government works in these antiquated policies or acts that don't really reflect what we live with today. And I'm thinking, you know, why not? Why isn't Canada really leading the charge? So when we have institutions like MEC, and the side story to the MEC affair is that we were emotionally charged by that. How many of you cared when Simpsons fell apart? You know what I mean? Like some of these commercial firms, when they go to the wayside, we're like, yeah, okay, they've done their time, story's done. But when MEC fell apart, everyone felt a bit of grief because something so special is now missing. And I think that speaks again, or it could be the capitalist environment wants to show how there's major mission drift in the cooperative sector, because that's really what they're frightened about. They're frightened about people, members coming together to actually not reform the economy, but to transform it. And so that's why the cooperative, I think, is so special, in that there is a huge opportunity to think about business in a really completely different way. And so thank you, Erin, for dropping that in my hat, because I think that we have to push our own government, both provincially and federally, to start really changing the narrative. So when they come up with these, what is it recently, the Black Entrepreneurship Fund, the partners that they primarily choose are those that harm Canadians, actually. These are commercial banks. And I'm thinking to myself, but our legacy has been in Desjardins and all these cooperative institutions. Why are they having this cultural amnesia? I mean, Serge spoke about the Acadian history of credit unions. That's not something we don't know. We know about this, so let's help remind them that we don't have to stick all these subsidies into TD or RBC, but why not try and find a cooperative player that can really come to the fore to kind of deal with inequities? Why do we have to continually partner with problematic financial lenders, right? And I think Erin is correct, and Wendy is really spot on when they're saying that within the co-op sector, not only do they have issues with diversity themselves, but they have to start speaking and pushing and being bolder with the government, both provincial and federally, to start really thinking about cooperatives as a viable vehicle for how we do business.
Well, it's really frustrating. What's frustrating to me is we just had a panel on TVO. So rarely are you on TVO talking about cooperatives, and it was all about cooperatives in healthcare. Because there have been 2 PSW, so personal support worker cooperatives, have launched in the last year or 2. And they're really, that's a really successful, amazing way of women getting together. It's mostly women, care workers, getting together and saying, we want a living wage, we want to do this care work, and we want to have autonomy, and we want to be able to say what our care work looks like, and we want to give great care, and we want to be ultimately responsible for it. And so they've created these beautiful cooperatives. The sub headline on the TVO article that wrote about this thing was about, is this becoming 2-tiered healthcare? And I just wanted to, I was screaming at my phone. This is not 2-tiered healthcare, because 2-tiered healthcare implies that there is privatization and government, but these cooperatives are democratic. I get so frustrated. It's this is not the boogeyman.
But that's the inherent bias in favoritism of certain types of businesses, right?
Yes, but if our long-term care homes, or even, let's take a step back. If elder care was cooperative, we may not need giant institutional long-term care homes, but if we did, and if they were cooperatively owned by the patients' families and the workers within them, just think about what kind of a caring environment that would be. The people who care about their mom and dad, and the people who want a job taking care of people without that sort of pressure, profit and cutbacks. They could just collectively make the best decisions for both parties. Anyway, coffee.
That's a really interesting case too, because it sounds a little bit like you've got PSWs forming co-ops that are also acting a little bit like a union.
Yes.
Like they're not just pooling resources to meet kind of mutual aims, but also kind of working together to solidify their employment conditions and protect workers' rights.
And just care, like, I don't know if you know people in PSW, like PSWs, but I talked to my sister-in-law and they just like, you can only spend 6 minutes with this patient, like in the morning, and you have to brush your teeth, go there, get them up, get them dressed, 6 minutes, then move on to the next one. It's like, what that's not caring.
And it's an entirely new category that didn't exist like 2 decades ago.
It's just horrible. It's just absolutely
And
horrible.
that's a cooperative principle, right? The idea of caring for community. So it kind of is consistent with the values that you would say. So that's what I mean in terms of not reform a system that is problematic, but actually transform it, right? Anyways.
That's my word of the year, transformation. I've now slipped it into
Yeah,
you.
otherwise
Word of the decade.
they'll keep colluding with the same problematic types of firms, right? And, you know, even if they want to stay in the for-profit arena, you do have cooperative institutions that are in that for-profit arena too, right?
Yeah, it's just the
So,
profit goes to work.
Just-
The profit goes to work to create more opportunity.
Right.
It's just, you know, where does the profit go? Does it go into some faceless shareholder's pocket? Or does it go back into, does it get reinvested in the community where the profit originated in order to improve life for everyone?
And that's the education that needs to be more amplified, because I think the more people understand that story or that definition of what a cooperative is, I think people will start to be interested in. There's a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of fear mongering about this is the model you have to use and cooperatives are the sideshow. Well, no, let's flip that script.
Let's do it together.
I'm conscious of the time. We've got about 15 minutes, 14 minutes, no, 11 minutes according to that clock, to go in the roundtable. I'd love to open things up to the floor. So
Are there chat questions?
both the real floor and the virtual floor.
So there's no one else on Teams aside from these 3 folks.
Okay,
So
so
they can raise
that's,
their hand and you'd be able to see the hand raise feature on here. If
okay.
you want to verbalize.
So
your
the
questions.
virtual floor is basically Arjan, and then
His hand
the
is up.
real floor is here.
Yeah.
Arjan has his hand up, excellent. Okay. The floor is yours.
Sorry, I raised my hand first, but also last, then I suppose. So thanks so much. There's been so much. You know, I feel I don't mind working from home, but in this conversation, I feel I really miss seeing everybody in person. It's a real shame. And thanks for the lecture yesterday as well, Caroline. It's you know, a real pity I couldn't make it. I so much interesting stuff. I'm now starting to read up on Mac, and I realize now I had a very different view of Mac. I moved to Canada in 2011, walked into Mac at 2012, and the only thing they told me about cooperative is the price of the tube for my bike increased from $8 to $13 because I had to pay for membership. So there was lots of issues of, you know, the cooperative organization no longer being cooperative anymore, because if I'd walked in there as a newcomer, they would have said this is a cooperative and you know, this is what we do here, right? So it's a you know, it's a very such an interesting history, and indeed, why do we not do much more with it? Well, the one thing I wanted to mention is, and it's also kind of a broader issue. My question to Serge is about this links between formal and informal. And I think Ian raised it last night, and Caroline, you've spoken to it. But I think there's still much more to be done. My own background to reveal that is I'm trained in history, and I'm from the Netherlands, and the cooperative movement in the welfare states in Europe is really way richer than we think it is. There are still major banks. I don't know if they're still cooperative. I don't know if private. I don't know what the institution is that still have a cooperative character. The health insurance system is still built on something like 10 old mutual organizations, and that seems to be absent in Canada. So there seem to be, and which would make sense because of a different demographic history, of course. The question that comes out of me, and it's not about the private sector taking over by any means, but it's actually about the government, the state policy facilitating that mutuality, that solidarity, or not, or wiping it out. And that's not only relevant in the European welfare states, but it's also so relevant if you take the SEWA example, for example. The two main challenge that SEWA faced was actually being recognized as a trade union. The government did not allow them to be registered as a trade union, and the trade union movement it didn't allow them to be registered as an insurance company either forever. Hence, my question is like, why is there so little investment in that? What investors will tell you is like until they formalize. Correct me if I'm wrong, until they're formalized, there's no way we can deal with that. But the formalization is actually, the problem of formalization is actually created by the governments that don't recognize the value of this and hence hinder their development. So for me, the question is, much more to be said, Caroline, I felt about that formal, informal links, how state policy recognize that and while maintaining the correct character of mutuality and the value of solidarity also allows it to become part of the mainstream.
Caroline, do you want to respond?
Yeah, no, I think that if I get you right, Arjan, is this idea that, even, the idea, like thinking through what does formality mean and informal. In many Indigenous communities here, I know scholars are thinking about the idea of something called non-formal, actually. So neither informal.
What does that mean?
And I actually think that maybe that's where we have to move. Like I understand there are members within the Roscoe or these kind of informal associations or self-help groups that would like some sort of consumer protection, particularly if they digitize more of what they're doing, because that, and it also protects them when authorities confiscate or what have you, or there's some sort of legal resource when something bad happens. So that is totally understandable. But there is also this aspect of, well, what can the state do? And I've had conversations with the Bank of Canada. What can we do when we think about informal? Like what kind of legislation can we start thinking about to start recognizing that, so that we don't see the informal as some sort of dark space that is questionable. And I think in some ways we are learning that informal institutions have a place in our economy, but how that'll work out in the Canadian welfare system is something that will take time, particularly when you think about how our state actually is kind of, not supporting or understanding even an alternative to commercial. So I'm even just thinking within the formal co-op sector, they're still dealing with rules and regulation and laws that govern those institutions in not a very updated way. So now I'm putting on the table, well, what about these informal cooperative systems? I mean, I think we actually do need to have a larger conversation about informality, but not to do away with it, because I don't think we're ever going to do away with it. But what does it mean to look, how do we configure it now into our economy? How do we include it as part of the state sort of responsibility, I think, in thinking through what that looks like? And I'm not sure what that's going to be exactly. I haven't done that part of the research, but I do think that that's my next plan, is to think through the policy implications of the research that I am doing on the ground. How do we then, maybe IDRC and FinDev and some of these other players can start actually thinking about resources to invest in this kind of knowledge, because I don't think we have a clue of how to move that forward. And we need to.
I love that idea of kind of thinking about taking the conversation forward, and certainly including folks from IDRC and FinDev and Global Affairs and others. It's interesting, we haven't once mentioned the CRA today, which I think would be, I mean, if you're talking, Ariane, about the state kind of recognizing and formalizing what is deemed informal, then I can think of no bigger institution in the Canadian context than the CRA, and then all sorts of reasons why organizations might want to avoid having a relationship with the CRA.
I was actually thinking about the Catholic schools, Greg.
I was thinking about cryptocurrencies, but yeah, I think.
No, the Catholic schools, as a case, that sounds like an informal institution to me, but has become the model of formal organization of our schools, right? Why this one and not the others? Right?
And getting public subsidies,
Yeah, totally. We've got two hands from the real floor here. I want to give them time. First is Joanne, the second is Emily.
Sorry, I was just gonna say, I just want to say what RJ just said about the Catholic school system. I didn't think about that, but that's actually a very clever idea. Oh, that helps the case actually when you think about things of how you can move things. If there's political will, you can actually change things to suit, right? A certain kind of, right?
There's a very interesting history in Ontario
of that, right? Okay, anyway, sorry.
Just please don't say that I suggested it, given that I'm a Protestant, of course.
Is sorry, Joanne. The floor
I just want to go back to kind of the broader context, like the neoliberal economics that are still basically the driving discourse and conceptualization behind public policy, both at the provincial and the national level. Like I'm maybe a little more familiar with the provincial level because I've worked in public policy mostly in the ag sector. But there's really a very simple narrative that drives this decision making, which is productivity, which you mentioned earlier, Aaron. We need to keep driving on productivity and good jobs. We need good jobs, okay? Which means like technology-based, high-paying, professional consultants. I don't know exactly what that means, good jobs, but they're not thinking about PSWs when they're thinking about good jobs, and that's the very sad thing. And so, you know, there is this kind of challenging narrative that's coming up now, which is about transition to a green economy and to a caring economy, and I think that's where the cooperative movement comes in, right? Is the narrative of we need to build a care economy, and so that you know, it gives recognition to those frontline workers that everyone talked about during COVID, and then everyone all of a sudden realized, oh my God, like our well-being is actually dependent on these people who we're paying an absolute pittance. And maybe we should do something about that. And then the laws of the world actually did pay them a little bit more for a period of time, but now we're back down to the basics. So, and then there's economists like Kate Raworth, who talks about the donut economy.
Yes, that's right.
Donut economics, and I think that's a very powerful model as well. So just like from a public policy perspective, in order to, you know, as a cooperative movement, I think that government is very, very good at ignoring it because it's frankly doesn't have a very strong voice when it comes to the overall political landscape. And so there needs to be an alignment with other interest groups and other kind of narratives that have traction. And so it's thinking about who else can a cooperative movement kind of link up with, formally and informally, and say, look, you know, instead of an economy that's going to basically create isolation and precarity, how about an economy where you know, mutuality is more built in and helps to stabilize, you know, and stop people from falling off the edge and into, frankly, then the state-funded welfare system. Because if you don't have those safety systems, that's what's going to happen. So, sorry, that wasn't really a question, but I just wanted to bring it back mostly to the bigger picture of we're still in that dominant paradigm of neoliberal economics, and it's starting to wane. And so, how can we accelerate that?
That's a great set of comments, Joanne, and it relates, I think, to a field that I actually did used to do some work in, and I think Ariane has too, on social protection. Social protection was kind of the flavor of the month about 10 years ago, and I think it still is. It still is. You see it in the form of guaranteed employment supplements and social insurance programs, food for work, cash for work. But it strikes me that aligning with the cooperative sector would give much more kind of continuity and force to that. The problem with social protection was it was always very aid dependent. Very rarely was it kind of in
The
the
charity
long run.
model.
Yeah,
Charity model.
it would disappear as soon as the financing and
Well,
the aid came to them.
what's interesting right now is the conversation that's happening around the CERB. That's where that.
Yeah.
The whole conversation on the CERB, and, you know, people were really advocating for a living wage. And now there are a lot of people saying, well, that was the experiment. Everybody got CERB, nobody worked. Which is so problematic. so
Inflation.
problematic.
Yeah.
But it is very problematic. But it does open the door for another conversation around, well, if that's not the model, then here's an alternative to explore. And you're absolutely right. Like, this door is opening and there is an opportunity, and we need to find like-minded organizations. You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that out loud. Like, you're absolutely right. Spot on everything you said.
By my clock, we're at noon. I want to give the final word though to Emily. You had a question? No pressure.
Can you say who you are first? My name is Emily. I'm a 5th-year undergrad student in the International Development Department. And I kind of wanted to, it was a perfect segue into what I was going to kind of ask or discuss with everybody, because I think one thing, Caroline, that you talked about last evening that really resonated with me was this idea of a network of cooperatives. And I think what you were saying is this kind of neoliberal paradigm that our society is existing in. I think networks sometimes lend themselves to isolation from integration with different types of non-cooperative groups. And so I think my question is, in a perfect world, obviously, because it's not something happening right now, but how do each of you envision those networks coming together? Is it coming together with other cooperatives only, or is it growing into, you know, larger networks that kind of integrate, like you were saying, non-cooperative groups?
And Wendy or
Sure.
I can jump in with a thought to kick off. I think that what we need, this is just my own personal gut feel after sort of talking with the cooperative sector over the last year about, you know, what do you do? That kind of thing. We need a problem to solve that kind of brings people behind it. I think the idea of let's have a chat about collaborating and see where it goes, there's not a lot of energy for that. But if we said collectively, here is a problem. Let's take food banks, for example. Credit unions give hundreds of thousands of dollars to food banks in their regions every year. And yet there is still a food bank, and yet everyone is still, you know, a client of the food bank. And we haven't solved that sort of systemic issue. So what if we said to the cooperative sector and then the networks that they are part of, you know, here's the problem, you know, this problem of hunger in our communities, and you obviously want to be a part of solving it, but how are we going to be more effective in solving it? So how do we bring together people on a sort of problem basis and make it online and make it accessible so that everyone can bring an idea? I'm just picturing this online whiteboard where the problem's in the center with a little pre-read. It's this is the problem. Throw things at this board, and the rule is you can't discount what somebody said. You can't say, oh, that'll never work. You just don't type in that box if you don't think it will work. And just add your thoughts. So that's my vision of how you might ask some big questions and invite the people who work in that space, or even if they don't work in that space, but they have this sort of intention to work in that space. How do you invite them to? But I think it sort of has to be driven by thinking about a big problem to draw people in.
Dorothy, bringing networks together.
Yeah, I would just like to add, great question. I mean, just to build on what Erin said, at NIDA we use what we call a market systems approach. And it's really, for me, been enlightening and eye-opening. Because I think it is, and using the food bank example, I think we need to step back and say, what are all the systems that are in place that continue to make food banks to perpetuate in that way? And in doing that, then we'll realize cooperative movements cannot do it alone. That's when we realize where's the private sector that needs to come in, where's the public sector that needs to come in, and where do the cooperatives fit? So I really believe that networking is beyond just the cooperative movement. It has to be with other players in the ecosystem, so that the problem actually then has a systems level intervention, to try to address it.
And on that theme, Serge, anything on bringing your networks or bringing networks together for this purpose?
I have to find my unmute button. Yeah, I don't know if I can add very much to what's been discussed so far. I mean, we're talking about it now. This is a great example of that discussion. We need to maybe get out of our bubble a little bit more. So I'll start to talk about cooperatives and their role in my day-to-day and see if I can influence people who might not otherwise have thought about cooperatives. But just the fact I was invited to this, quite frankly, has made me think about some of these topics, which is I think the purpose of this discussion.
Absolutely, and nice to see our so-called interdisciplinary hub being used in a way that advances really good interdisciplinary thinking. Wendy, any final thoughts on building networks?
No, I'm not sure that I have anything else to add either, except that to say, sometimes we get in our own way. So we talked about needing to look at the cooperative principles, and autonomy and independence is also one of the cooperative principles. And I think sometimes maybe it's just a human nature thing. We like to think that we own the solution or the pattern or the path or the way to go about something. I think we really need to sort of push against that principle in terms of breaking down those kind of barriers, so we do come to the table, like Erin was suggesting, rallying around a problem, or as Dorothy was saying, like rallying around the system and figuring out what systems need to change, rather than just being so confident that we have the way, or the right solution. So I think it's that creativity. It's what Serge was talking about, like throwing things out there, putting stuff on that whiteboard Erin envisioned, and not getting so hung up on something having to look or feel a very specific way.
I love that idea. Yeah. Just I agree that we're at this moment where there are all sorts of doors opening, some closing, but now is the time to start thinking creatively and ambitiously. On that note, Caroline, any last words?
No, I think that we both summed it up, right? I think that we all, as Serge says, we have homework to do, and if there are ways that we can continue this conversation together, and hopefully we can get this video recorded, right? Shared elsewhere into our networks, so that people can see that we're starting that quiet revolution, so we can start educating people in the different spaces we are to think about how we can do things more collaboratively and democratic in terms of our economy, and how we include all these different voices, but in a very practical way. So I thank everyone for coming today to continue this conversation. I hope we're not ending it like this, but we can continue this conversation again at some point.
Absolutely. It's not farewell, it's just adieu for now. But thank you to everyone, the participants online.
Thank you for including me.
Oh, yes. Thank you for coming, or thank you for being there, as our local CBC announcer says. Thank you to everyone here in the room today. It's been a wonderful event. I keep saying this, and I sound like a broken record, but it is so special and amazing to be together here on campus once again after so long, and such a fitting and appropriate conversation around the Hopper lecture. I'm sure David Hopper would be very proud. I know I certainly am. So thank you, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.